50 years ago, Knott's Berry Farm would open their first ever roller coaster, and since then they have had 15 different roller coasters over the years in the park. Most of these coasters have stuck around, while a few others have left the park, but either way, all these coasters play an important role in the creation of what Knott's Berry Farm is today. So that's why today I want to take a look back over the last 50 years at a timeline of Knott's Berry Farm's roller coasters to check out how their roller coaster lineup has evolved over the years, and just to see some of the older coasters that unfortunately aren't at Knott's today. So anyways, let's of course get right into it. In 1975, Knott's Berry Farm would open their first ever roller coaster, and it would not be a disappointment. This first coaster they opened was of course a first of its kind roller coaster, with it being the first modern day coaster to go upside down. And this first coaster they added was simply known as Corkscrew, named after its iconic double corkscrew element, and the layout of the coaster was fairly simple, featuring only one drop, a double corkscrew, but still it was a very thrilling ride at the park and definitely stood out as a roller coaster landmark. And just a year after opening their first coaster, Knott's would get right back at it and open up another. This time they opened a simple yet fun steeplechase style coaster where riders would follow along a tube track as they rode on motorcycles. And this coaster was nothing too crazy, it just featured some slight turns and drops, but it was still a fun ride at the park at the time and definitely one a lot of people wanted to go on. Moving on now to 1978, where Knott's would open what is definitely one of their most popular rides, known as Montezoomas Revenge. This coaster was a boomerang style coaster where it launched riders one way through the track and then the other at a very fast speed, where it launched riders from 0 to 55 in only about 4 seconds. This coaster was also made by infamous coaster manufacturer Schwarzkopf, known for making some really intense rides out there, and it also features one of their rare flywheel launch systems that only about 8 other coasters in the world still have today. And overall, it's a really fast and intense roller coaster and definitely one of the best in Knott's Berry Farm. Jumping over now to 1980, where Knott's would redo their motorcycle chase coaster into Wacky soapbox racers. And to do this, they basically just took off the old motorcycle cars and replaced it with these new Wacky soapbox racer cars, which looked pretty cool. It utilized the same track and layout, so it didn't really change too much from that. Having these new sort of cars definitely allowed for a slightly different ride experience, and overall, I do like the look of the Wacky soapbox racers definitely more than the motorcycle chase. And in 1983, the park would open its original kiddie coaster known as Timberline Twister. This coaster opened up along with the Camp Snoopy Land in 1983. The coaster featured a very simple layout with a couple of turns and little bumps, but for kids it was certainly a fun ride and one of the only rides in the park at the time that was sort of made for kids. And overall, it was a ride that a lot of people loved and lasted in the park for many years. 14 years after it debuted at the park, Knott's would make the decision to remove the Corkscrew roller coaster from the park to make way for a new, bigger attraction. It did suck to lose this iconic roller coaster, since it was of course the first inverted coaster and definitely had a lot of history behind it. But fortunately, the ride was not scrapped. It was instead sent to Silverwood Theme Park in Athol, Idaho, where it still operates today under the same name, and has also gotten a plaque to commemorate it as the first ever inverted coaster, which is really cool. And right after they removed the corkscrew, they immediately started construction of a new coaster on that plot of land where it once sat, and this new coaster was of course known as Boomerang. And at the time, this ride model was a very popular one, popping up at a lot of different amusement parks, mainly for it being a cheaper ride model and one that could easily fit into a smaller plot of land. So this coaster, they of course ended up opening in 1990, and overall it was a decent replacement for the corkscrew. It featured multiple inversions, so it definitely gave a thrilling experience similar to corkscrew, and overall was a ride that fit pretty well into the park at the time. Jumping forward now to 1995, where the park would open another new coaster, this time known as Jaguar, and this new coaster they opened was a very cool one. The ride itself was nothing too crazy, it was just a family ride that went around the Fiesta Village section of the park, but the really cool part about it was the station they built for this ride. They built this whole pyramid which looks really cool and definitely stands out as one of the coolest parts of the Fiesta Village section of Knott's Berry Farm. So overall, it was a more tame coaster, but it was still a cool one that gave some nice views of that area of the park that sat in. And a year after Jaguar opened, they ended up closing yet again another coaster at Knott's Berry Farm. This time they closed the Wacky Soapbox Racers, mainly due to the ride just starting to age. Removing this coaster also opened up a fairly big area in the park for them to develop into some new rides or other stuff. So overall, it was a little bit sad to see this ride go, but it did end up opening some space for some new coasters and rides to end up opening. Of course, a year after closing Wacky Soapbox Racers, in 1997 the park would open yet again another new ride, this time the Windjammer Surf Racers. And this coaster was a sort of new idea for a coaster that's never really been seen before. It was supposed to be a dueling looping Crazy Mouse coaster, which was an interesting idea, but overall in execution it didn't turn out too well. The ride is notorious for giving terrible rides, constantly breaking down, and just giving a very terrible rider experience. The biggest problem with the ride is just that it was designed very poorly, with malfunctioning restraints, misaligned tracks, and it also could not operate in wind, which is very crazy. So overall, it was just a very terrible ride and definitely deserves the reputation it got for being the worst ride ever in Knott's Berry Farm history. And a year after opening what is probably their worst coaster ever, Knott's would come back and open up their best coaster ever, known as Ghostrider. This coaster was a wooden style coaster, and overall it was a very unique ride because unlike other rides in the park that sort of stayed within the boundaries, this coaster went outside those boundaries into the marketplace and parking lot area. And looking at it from outside the park when you're in those parking lot and marketplace areas definitely looks very cool as having this big coaster there. And this coaster is definitely regarded as one of the best coasters at Knott's Berry Farm. And not only that, but it's also often said to be one of the best wooden coasters on the West Coast. The ride has some awesome drops and a ton of airtime, and overall is just a really solid coaster and definitely one of my favorites in the park there. Moving on now to 2000, where just 3 years after opening, Knott's would finally shut down the Windjammer Surf Racers ride, and at the time they decided to close it, they had already limited operations on this ride to one track only, which really just showed the state that this coaster was in. They also attempted to sue the company after this that built and designed it, claiming that they built an improper coaster. Unfortunately, they never won this lawsuit, but still it did have a big impact on the company that built the coaster as they went bankrupt just a couple of years after this. But overall, they shut down this ride and it left a big area in the park for a new coaster to of course be built and offer a way better experience. Hopping over now to 2002, where Knott's would of course replace their Windjammer Surf Racers coaster with a new ride known as Xcelerator. And this new coaster was a very big one, stand over 200 foot tall, and was of course made by Intamin and was their company's first hydraulically launched roller coaster. And this coaster model was actually one that a lot of other big coasters were based off of, like Top Thrill Dragster and Kinda. And to this day, Xcelerator is still the tallest roller coaster at Knott's Berry Farm, and definitely one of the fastest at a total speed of 82 miles per hour, which is really fast. So overall, this coaster was a lot better than Windjammer Surf Racers and was definitely a better use of the area than that other coaster. Moving on now to 2004, where Knott's would open their next new coaster, this time Silver Bullet, their inverted coaster. And this coaster was definitely one that added to the Knott's skyline, especially in some spots of the park. Like when you walked into the entrance, you'd see the massive Cobra roll of this ride, or throughout some parts of Fiesta Village or Ghost Town, you'd be able to see all the cool just inversions and just how this ride flowed, which was cool. Before they opened this ride, they also had a charity auction where the winners of that auction would be able to get on the first ride ever on Silver Bullet, which this was really cool and definitely a fun idea of the park to do. And the coaster ended up opening to the public on December 7th of 2004, and overall was a ride that a lot of people in the park loved. Moving on now to 2007, where Knott's would open another first of its kind roller coaster, where this time they'd open the first spin-in roller coaster in the United States to feature trains with multiple spin cars, instead of trains that only featured one spinning car on them. And this spinning coaster they added was a smaller one, sort of packed into this little area beside the Camp Snoopy entrance, but even though it had a smaller layout and wasn't too tall, it still was a very fun ride, and if you had the right amount of weight on this, you can get some really good spins on this ride. And overall, it's a more unique ride with the spin feature, which definitely makes it one that a lot of people love going on Knott's Berry Farm. And just a year after opening Sierra Sidewinder, Knott's would open up another new coaster that was certainly another more unique one. This time they'd open up Pony Express, which this was a launch style coaster where the seats on it were actually horses that you sit on, which made it very unique. And this new coaster would be themed after the Pony Express mail service, and the attraction was designed to give riders a similar experience to that mail service, where riders would zoom over hills and around corners, and overall it was definitely a very fun experience. And the coaster is definitely a shorter one, lasting only around 30 seconds, but it is still certainly a thrilling one, launching riders up to 38 miles per hour in only 3 seconds, and it offers a pretty good view of the ghost town area of Knott's Berry Farm. So in 2012, Knott's would close their Perilous Plunge ride, and then a year after that, in 2013, on part of that plot of land, they'd open up a new coaster known as Ghostrider. And this coaster was a Wild Mouse style coaster, having hairpin turns all over it and also featuring a couple of larger drops and turns, and overall it was a pretty good ride. And one big complaint about Ghostrider is the restraints on it, as if you're a taller rider it has these weird leg things that are meant to keep your legs into place, but it really pushes on your legs and definitely doesn't make it the greatest experience. But overall it's still a fun coaster, and definitely going around those turns is just so awesome. Jumping forward now to 2017, where Knott's would once again close another coaster. This time they'd close the Boomerang, which had been operating the park since the 90s. In this coaster they ended up removing it since it sat on a decent sized plot of land where they thought they could build a much bigger and cooler coaster. So of course in 2017 they ended up removing this coaster from the park and replacing it with a much cooler coaster. After removing the Boomerang, Knott's would of course get started building a brand new coaster, and this new coaster would not be a disappointment. The new coaster was of course known as Hangtime, and was a coaster that featured a vertical lift and a layout full of inversions. And these inversions, just like the ride's name suggests, offers a lot of hangtime for riders and overall makes it a very thrilling experience. The coaster also features a very nice lighting package, and in the night you can basically see this ride from anywhere, and overall it just looks so awesome. Jumping forward now to 2023, which was just a couple years ago, Knott's would close another one of their coasters, this time Timberline Twister. This ride they'd close as they were trying to redo parts of Camp Snoopy to make it better, and this coaster was one that was starting to age a bit and just wasn't as good as some of the other rides in the park. So of course they end up removing it, and this left a spot for a brand new kiddie coaster to open. And of course, a year after closing Timberline Twister, Knott's would open a brand new kiddie coaster, this time being Snoopy's Tenderpaw Twister. And this new roller coaster was a lot better than the Timberline Twister, I'd say. Just looking at it, it has a lot more theming, which is really cool, especially the coaster car there, which is driven by Snoopy. The coaster also has a cool launch feature, as drive tires that pushes it up over some of the turns. And of course, the ride layout is pretty cool, featuring just some helixes, but overall it's definitely a awesome ride for kids. And yeah, this coaster just looks a lot better in that area than Timberline Twister. Moving on now to 2025, where right now not too much is happening with roller coasters at Knott's Berry Farm. They pretty much filled up all the available areas, so to open a new coaster they'd have to close down some other coasters or rides in the park, which I'm not sure if they would want to do that right now. Now, I will say if they were to build a new coaster, one area that could have some stuff torn down and it would be cool to see a new coaster there is, of course, where Ghostrider and Xcelerator is. Ghostrider is just an all-right coaster. It's nothing crazy, so I don't think it would be too missed if they removed it. And then, of course, Xcelerator, it seems to be having a lot of downtime recently, and I'm not sure if that ride will even survive much longer. I guess we'll have to see, but that area might be a spot where sometime in the future we'll see new coasters opening. Another thing I want to mention is Montezoomas Revenge has been closed since around 2022 now. It was expected to reopen after its new refurbishment in 2023. Unfortunately, that was delayed, and last year in 2024 they did announce that it would reopen in 2025. Currently, there's no opening date yet, but hopefully 2025 will be the year that we see the updated Montezoomas Revenge back open at Knott's Berry Farm. And with all that said, everyone, that's of course going to finish it for today's video. Hopefully you all enjoyed. If you did, please make sure to like and subscribe and comment down below what your favorite roller coaster is out of all these roller coasters they've had over the years. And if you're a fan of Halloween, go check out my other channel, which I've linked down below. Anyways, I'll of course see you all next time. Goodbye.